Thanks for tuning in today. I'm Dr. Nick, the Incrementalist. Join me as I seek out the small incremental changes being applied in other industries that we can learn from and that can be applied in healthcare. Can these changes bring immediate value but also add up to the big improvements and the revolution we need in healthcare? Come along with me to explore the possibilities. My innovative guests from around the globe have used small incremental improvements to achieve their moonshot. And today, I'm talking to Dr. Andrew Chacko. He's a healthcare innovator and a design thinker. Andrew, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks, Nick. It's great to be on the show.
So, Andrew, you and I met at a conference a while back, and at the time, you were delivering a design thinking webinar. And one of the things that really struck me about that was your incredibly different perspective on the way that things should be looked at from the perspective of design thinking versus sort of regular thinking. Can you share a little bit about your journey as to how you reach that? Because you're a physician, but you're also a physician with this unique perspective and viewpoint on the design and the impact of design on healthcare.
Great. Yeah, it's a wonderful story that I am glad to have been a part of. So I started off my career as a leader, focused on leadership and teamwork. I went through the Naval Academy to get some expertise and grounding in that, and then and served 12 years in the Navy as an officer. And when I decided to go back to school, having been an engineer, I was looking for something a little bit more and found this program that was a joint program, mechanical engineering and art. And having been an artist even longer than an engineer, I fell in love with the idea and decided that was it. Didn't know much more about it. And that's where I learned design and design thinking. And what I realized, actually all along, I'd been applying creative problem solving skills, which is essentially what design thinking is, in the leadership capacity that I've been in, throughout my life. And now I just had some formalized tools around it. So I kind of came to understand that I was just wired as a designer. And I'll get into a little bit more of what that means. So I was at Stanford for 2 years and decided to stay an extra year to do robotics and work at IDEO and do some design work on my own, as well as teach design, and thought, I want to apply this to an area that really needs some good redesign. And at the time, I saw some doctors running around with pagers, and I thought, wow, I can design something better than that. That was rather simplistic thinking on my part, although I still think we can do a lot better than pagers. And thought, well, and as I started to interview people that were designing in that field, found that one of the struggles they were having was, as designers, was actually connecting with clinicians and bridging that gap. And again, simplistic thinking being what it was, I thought, well, I guess the solution is to go to medical school and become a doctor and design from the inside. I'm a pretty good student. How hard could medical school be? Yeah, it was a little more difficult than I anticipated, but nonetheless made it through. So I had started down this journey with the idea of designing in medicine. It was just my exposure to medicine became better and better, and I started understanding more about what the problems that medicine was facing. And as I was finishing with med school, I had this amazing opportunity presented to me to go to Media Lab and at MIT and build what was to be the future of healthcare. What did medicine look like in the future? New media medicine is what they were calling it. But there was a little voice in the back of my head that was saying, at this point, I'm just a glorified medical student. I had my MD, but I didn't really understand healthcare. And there were plenty of very smart people coming out of medical school, going straight into industry. And yet we were faced many of the same problems that, weren't getting solved. They weren't evaporating. So I think I needed to crack the healthcare nut a little bit more, and ended up deciding to go to residency, finish residency, and then started practicing medicine. And all of that just started informing my thoughts about what was what are some of the problems or what are some of the difficulties we have facing medicine? So, as one of my friends put it, I was a designer that went to medical school to better understand healthcare, as opposed to a physician that needed to design or come up with some innovation or innovative ideas. A little bit backwards approach, but the approach really helped me kind of understand or come to the conclusions that I've come to or see the things that I've seen.
So one of the things that really strikes me about that story, not least of all, huge amount of respect for somebody that not only wanted to but got into the Naval Academy. I mean, just enormously challenging sort of pathway, but then to go on and qualify, turn down a really extraordinary job. And as you describe it, you've come at this from a completely different perspective. You learn medicine to apply it into the design world, but the majority of the clinicians that I know, went into medicine. That was their sort of primary focus. And one of the things I'm really interested to sort of tease out, if you can think about it, is what are the things that you can help those physicians to think differently? And I'm reminded of some of the exercises that you had in that session that we had. That there were some things that really, well, blew my mind a little bit. I mean, I think they changed my perspective. It was like putting on a pair of glasses and, opening up a whole new visual imagery. Can you share some of those experiences?
Sure, yeah. One thing that I'd meant to mention before, and to close a loop, is for me, thinking like a designer means being inherently discontent. No matter how good things are, I think we can always make things better. And it's not resting on your laurels of like, okay, well, now I made a Tesla or the new iPhone or something like that. There's always room to do something better. Like, definitely celebrate the accomplishment and the victory, and then start cracking the next nut. So part of that, when I teach clinicians design, one of the things that is behind that for me is when I look at my success as a psychiatrist, and I've been fortunate to be pretty successful with my patients and dealing with them, is I approach all of them as design problems. So if you were to come in with your twin with the exact same problems and the exact same, symptoms, I'm still going to try to understand you and how you are different and an individual, because you have constraints on your life and different priorities even than your twin might. And if you have kids and he doesn't or she doesn't, and that could be an issue if, different jobs, different locations, all these things feed into different priorities, certainly. Like, that's going to feed into our care. So when I'm teaching design, it's about, certainly with clinicians, it's about how can this be an effective clinical tool? And then certainly you can take these same principles and start like hacking the system itself, like everything from the microsystem or the local environment you're operating in, and then to the larger healthcare system. And I want to get back to your question, which is like about how we can start thinking differently. And part of it is there's many tricks or like ways to shortcut that. There's one, the 5 whys, which is basically when you come upon a process, like ask, why do we do it this way? And why again, until you get to like in the underlying fundamental sort of like, this is what we're trying to accomplish. And then when you're able to zoom out from that desired goal, then you can start looking at like, okay, are there other ways to meet that need or get that accomplished? So that's one method to start thinking differently and questioning like some of our very basic assumptions. It's funny, we walk around daily and we have to make assumptions about a lot of things. Otherwise, questioning everything would just lead to chaos. But there are some things that, that we accept or we take for granted that if we just asked, why are we doing it this way? We could come up with a whole different, possibly much more effective or efficient solution. That's the thing that comes to the top of my head. I want to make sure that I was answering your question appropriately, or if that made sense.
Yeah, no. So one of the things that I'm reminded of from the session was, one of the primary rules in sort of design thinking is whatever you first come up with, have no sort of ownership, as it were. Be prepared to throw that out, toss it out. It's this sort of process of, just expect failure almost is what I
Definitely.
interpret that. And the capacity to sort of change that thinking. And, for physicians in particular, you've been through medical school, you know how hard it is to get through and, the sort of incredible pressures that are placed. Ultimately, when you emerge from that, it's very easy to fall into this sort of mentality that says, well, I'm at the pinnacle of my knowledge, my experience. Everything I do must be brilliant, right? But it's clearly not. And
Everything you do is definitely brilliant.
one of the things that we have to do is to sort of force that. And you had a number of exercises. I think my favorite was the think of something terrible exercise.
Right. Yeah. And then, so that was think of something that is possibly the worst idea imaginable, and then swap it with someone else, swap your idea with someone else, and both of you then try to figure out, like, in what context that might be actually a good idea. You brought up something that was actually really important. So that's a really fun exercise, and it's great to get kind of creative juices flowing and starting to think like, well, the things that we think are horrible ideas might actually, there are certain situations where, stretching it a little, it might fly. But one thing you hit on that I think is really important is this fear of failure, right? Like, I think from the very get-go, in medicine, we start equating failure with morbidity and mortality. Like, somehow, if we get this wrong, patients are going to die or get very sick, or something bad is going to happen. And we start equating that sort of rigidity and that mentality to almost everything we do in medicine, for even things that don't have that kind of consequence. Things like, something rearranging the chairs in the waiting room would not have that sort of gravitas around it, and yet it's we approach all of these decisions with that similar, like, we better get it right the first time. And one of the hard things is, like, if we're going to come up with new and novel solutions, if you're trying things that have never been tried before, more than likely you're going to fail. More than likely, something is going to be a bad idea and it's going to fall on its face. And to get okay with that failure, and to be okay with not knocking it out of the park every single time. And then how do you learn from that failure? Those are really valuable lessons, or really valuable things to take away. And then learning that, how can you apply that to the rest of your life?
So for those of you just joining, tuning in, I'm Dr. Nick, the Incrementalist, and today I'm talking to Dr. Andrew Chacko, a healthcare innovator and specifically a design thinker. So Andrew, as you went through your career, and specifically now, one of the things that you offer as part of the services is to go in and help people think differently and to come up in a different way to solve problems in healthcare. And we seem awash with challenges in healthcare. Although somebody said something really interesting to me recently: healthcare isn't broken; it's working as designed, and the original design is actually incorrect. But put that to one side, and think about some of the problems. And as you approach this, have you had some specifically good experiences or some examples that you can share of ways in which you've applied design thinking that has had a big impact through some small changes?
Yeah, certainly. And before I get into that, I actually wanted to address that quote, which I think is actually spot on. I think one of the best challenges that we're facing is actually being very intentional about the medicine that we want to practice, and the medicine and the healthcare that we want to have, and intentionally setting out like this is our goal, and then how do we pull the tools, the resources, the systems into place to create that healthcare, instead of inadvertently stumbling into this with this kind of these little tweaks here and there that don't ultimately step out and see like, okay, what are we trying to accomplish? And my favorite example is not a personal one. It's a story of the Embrace infant warmer. And there were 5 students that got together in 2007 at Stanford at the D School. And this is a school that grew out of the program I went through. And so they came from the business school and engineering and different disciplines, and they were presented with a problem of premature infant mortality. So every year, roughly 20 million infants are born prematurely. Of that, about 1 million die within the first 24 hours by some estimates. And 4 million die within the first 4 weeks, again, by other estimates. These aren't like really super great things to have statistical measures on, because obviously these kids aren't able to even access healthcare. But most of them, the biggest problem facing these babies is hypothermia. They're not able to regulate their own body temperature and maintain it at the right temperature. And for the ones that are able to, that's a huge energy sink, and that's stealing precious energy away from developing the organs that need to be developed for later in life. And so even the ones that survive end up with chronic problems and cardiac problems and a whole host of other issues. So they set about tackling it, and they thought, okay, and the first world solution is this $20,000 incubator. That must be the problem. It's way too expensive for these third world countries that are having the majority of these problems. Well, one of the kids, students, I should say, ended up flying to Nepal. And while he was walking through one of the hospitals, he saw all these unused incubators sitting around. And he thought, well, that doesn't make sense. How are they having a lot of premature infant death if all these incubators are sitting here unused? And he asked the doctor, and the doctor looked at him and said, the infants aren't dying here, they're dying in the villages. And something clicked, something was off about that. So they went back and started thinking, the user they were designing for wasn't the doctor. It was actually the mother in the village. And a mother that didn't have access to a clinician and didn't have access to electricity, both of which is what you need to operate an incubator successfully. And on top of that, this mother often didn't trust Western medicine. So if she were told to take 2 teaspoons of something, very likely she'd take 1 thinking the medicine was too strong. Or if the baby is supposed to be at 37 degrees, 30, that sounds a little too hot. Maybe 30 degrees is a better. And, for those of us in the audience that know like what a good temperature is, 30 degrees is not a great temperature for a newborn baby. So they started working on the real problem. And this is what I call the black hole or the rabbit hole of design. All of a sudden, this, like, you don't know where this path is going to go. And what they ended up coming up with was a brilliant solution, basically a sleeping bag using space age technology and materials. But essentially, it's a sleeping bag. And there's a sleeve in the back where they put a paraffin wax sleeve, or a slot in the back where they put a paraffin wax sleeve that you can heat up in a pot of boiling water, and it takes advantage of phase change. So as the wax goes from like solid to liquid, it absorbs a lot of energy and stays at the right temperature, or liquid to gas, it'll stay at the same temperature. So it's able to maintain its temperature for up to 5 hours and then keep the baby warm. And if you think about where the baby's ideally supposed to be at this time, it wouldn't be premature. It would be in the mother's womb. So if you compare these 2 solutions now, this sleeping bag where the mother can take the baby home, bond with it, breastfeed, we all know about the benefits of oxytocin and mother-infant bonding, compared to a plastic box in a hospital under lights, separated from its mother. I would say that this solution is actually a much better solution and at 1/200th the price. And actually, there was a study that came out recently where they compared two groups of babies in incubators, one that got massage, 15 minutes of massage 3 times a day, and those that didn't. And they found the ones that got massage, just that 45 minutes of massage daily, actually hit their milestones much more quickly. So if you think about the baby being carried around in this papoose, so to speak, it's much more likely to get that physical stimulation, and on top of everything else, start meeting its milestones just from that physical stimulation alone. So when we start zooming out and understanding what the real problem is, and that's what they run into when they realize that the problem wasn't that the incubators were too expensive. The problem was babies needed to stay warm. They were able to expand the ideas of what the solution needed to be.
So you capture one of my most sort of important areas of sort of focus and genuine passion. So I'm a proud African. I was born in Nigeria. I'm a proud immigrant from that country. And I look back at that continent and many of these other continents with so few resources. And what you describe is that innovation that takes place in those environments with much less in the way of resources. And, I always love, the way that people become. So part of me thinks that, having less actually creates more innovation. There's an interesting study that I for the life of me, I can't trace down anymore, but essentially cited the top 3 innovative countries as Israel, Nigeria, and the United States, which, interesting mix.
I completely agree that those constraints actually sort of breed some ingenuity. Like, we got to find a workaround, as opposed to thinking that we could just throw more money at the problem.
So unfortunately, we're approaching the end, and I always like to ask my guests at the end my sort of closing question. If you think about the future and some of the challenges that we face, and put yourself in the perspective of some of the people faced with those challenges, what one small piece of behavior perhaps, or perhaps a different perspective or a different way of sort of thinking about things, could you suggest that might help people be more open to those alternative views, to shift their perspective in a way that would sort of open up new avenues?
Great question. How would I have them think about things in the future moving forward? Well, one of the things is I think about the future of healthcare that we're trying to create. One of the fundamental drivers for me is, are we allowing greater connection to our clinicians? Are we facilitating a better relationship between all the members of the healthcare team? Or are we distracting from that and using that as a sort of gauge of, is this a good direction? We seem to be at a kind of divergence of where we think technology is going to solve everything. And I'm a huge technophile, but I heartily disagree. I think technology is here to really facilitate the human connection that is so fundamental to our happiness and our great experience and our health and well-being. And so whenever we see things that aren't going in that direction, questioning that and try to push the needle in the other direction.
Fantastic. So, Andrew, I want to thank you for joining me on the show today. It's always a pleasure. I always get new insights and new perspectives, and I think others will too. And I would encourage you, go visit his website, Chacko, CHACKOMD.com. You can learn more about him and design thinking, and even find out more about those concepts. Thanks for joining me today. Do you have better ideas, or have you found small incremental changes that have brought about a big improvement in your world? Let's continue the conversation on our hashtag, The Incrementalist, or share with me at DrNick1 on Twitter. You can find more information about the show on our program page at healthcarenowradio.com. I'm Dr. Nick, and I'm The Incrementalist.